Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rose Jackson, and I lead a soon-to-be-announced policy initiative at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, the preeminent center studying, reporting on, and advancing solutions for disinformation, democratic information spaces, and the challenges to human rights posed by tech and society. It's my pleasure to welcome you all virtually to our multi-part event today on disinformation, domestic extremism, and the threat to democracy. This event is the first in a series of conversations focusing on the nexus of disinformation, platform governance, and domestic extremism. I'll get us kicked off for the first session with Congressman Tom Malinowski and NPR's Kelly McEvers momentarily, but want to encourage you to stick around for the second panel just after this with Shereen Mitchell and our own DFRLab disinformation and right-wing extremist experts for a deep dive on the organizing that led to the events of January 6th. Let me turn now to our first session of the day and introduce our moderator, Kelly McEvers. Kelly is a two-time Peabody Award-winning journalist and former host of NPR's flagship news magazine, All Things Considered. She spent much of her career as an international correspondent, reporting from Asia, the former Soviet Union, and the Middle East. She's the creator and host of the acclaimed Embedded podcast, a documentary show that goes to hard places to make sense of the news, increasingly here in the United States. If I may take the prerogative to say before handing this off to Kelly, what occurred at the US Capitol a few weeks ago is but one horrifying event in a long chain of actions that undermine democracy in this country. It is a real benefit to discuss these issues today with both Kelly and the Congressman, two people who have spent their careers following challenges to democracy and rights the world over. What we're discussing today is neither uniquely American nor an issue of the past. So join me in welcoming Kelly McEvers and Congressman Tom Malinowski for this important discussion. Kelly?
Thanks so much, Rose. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here today. Welcome everyone virtually to the first panel of this DFRLab event, Disinformation, Domestic Extremism, and the Threat to Democracy. I'm joined, as you said, by Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. We're gonna have a conversation about disinformation and the real world ramifications of this growing movement of violent right-wing extremism. The Congressman has personally experienced the consequences of disinformation and the threats of violence that can arise from that. And we're going to talk about that, hopefully at length. He spent much of his career working with human rights activists around the world as the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch and later the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Congressman Malinowski and I will spend the first part of our time talking about this personal experience with QAnon and misinformation before the attack on the Capitol. We'll also talk about that day, and we'll talk about some solutions that he has proposed to deal with this problem. Congressman, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Really glad to be here with you.
Awesome. I want to just get into, I just kind of want to walk through time a little bit, if we could, starting last fall and kind of walk through some of the things that you've gone through. Mainly because I think it's really important for people to understand this stuff is to really just sort of understand how these networks work, how disinformation kind of makes its way from the online space into the real world and poses real world threats. And first, it seems like for you in recent history, things started in August when you sponsored a bipartisan resolution denouncing QAnon. Can you just talk about that? Like, first of all, what prompted you to do that? What was in the resolution? And then we'll get to what happened afterward.
Sure. Well, I did it because QAnon is it's bad, it's dangerous. And I've been following the rise of extremism in this country for some time. We've seen attacks on places of worship, on African-American churches and synagogues and shopping malls. And it seemed to me that this QAnon movement, which began as a wacky, crazy conspiracy theory about Pizzagate that people dismissed because it seemed so crazy, had grown into a movement online with millions of adherents. And it seemed to me that QAnon had become like a little blue pill that people take to immunize themselves against reality in America and increasingly around the world. It's sort of the gateway drug to extremism, because once you get into these QAnon forums, which teach you to dismiss every objective source of reality and fact, you then open your mind, so to speak, to virtually every form of conspiracy theory or disinformation known to humankind, beginning with the ancient blood libel. That's kind of what QAnon is built around. And that then makes for fertile ground in the minds of all of these folks for violent extremist groups to begin to recruit them to violence. And we saw that is exactly what happened. So, we did a resolution in the House. I never thought that the House of Representatives condemning QAnon would make it go away. But I thought it was really, really important to get the leaders of our country, Republicans as well as Democrats, on record as saying this is out of bounds. We do not stand for this, because it seems to me that when responsible leaders play around with these people or suggest that they may think that they're okay, that it gives them license and legitimacy. And I think that was also demonstrated on January 6th.
Right. I mean, so it sounds like, one of the points of the resolution was to just get people to take this seriously. I mean, I think a lot of us were just kind of laughing for a long time, right? Like, these guys are kooks, they're crazy, but they're over there, they're in weird town. Like, we don't, you know what I mean? We don't have to really worry about them. So what happened then with the resolution?
I got a vote, which is not easy in the House of Representatives. You have to convince the leadership that it's important enough to dedicate time. We finally got that. We had an overwhelming bipartisan vote. This was the good news. Most Republicans and all the Democrats voted with us, but there were 17 Republicans who refused to vote to condemn QAnon. And those 17, you can imagine there's a lot of overlap between those 17 and the ones who later on refused to accept the results of the election, buying into that QAnon style conspiracy theory. And, I think that cuckoo caucus or QAnon caucus was sort of revealed, unmasked by that vote. And unfortunately, it's grown since.
Yeah, I was going to say, were you surprised that there were 17 who voted against?
No, I was worried it would be more at that point, right? Because you never know. These things get partisan. I was worried, Republicans would get up there and say, yes, QAnon's bad, but unless you put Antifa into this resolution, I can't vote for it, that they'd come up with some excuse.
Right.
I always try to write stuff. I try to use language that is unifying and that doesn't sound partisan. I appeal to sentiments like patriotism and national security, which this resolution was sort of written around. And so we were I took it as a win that only 17 voted on the cuckoo side. But obviously we knew, like, just getting the condemnation was the beginning of a long road. And, even today, like, we have, I'm fast forwarding now, but we're having a lot of interesting debate right now in the House of Representatives family about what our responsibilities are in this moment. Yeah. And should people be expelled? Should they be condemned and censured? For me, the minimum requirement right now of membership in a respectable governing body in this country is consistent condemnation of groups like QAnon and the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys and the Three Percenters and the Oath Keepers and all of these violent extremist groups that have unfortunately gotten a foothold within one of our major political parties. I need to see my fellow members of Congress consistently say, no, you are not who we are. And we reject the nonsense that you put forward. And some Republicans have been very courageous in the last couple of weeks, braving all kinds of threats to stand up to these people, but others, as we've seen, are, a little more cowardly.
Do you think you could get a similar vote today?
Yeah, I think we could. And, we're not going to rerun that resolution. Next week, I'm leading a resolution in the House censuring one of my fellow members, a guy named Mo Brooks, Congressman Mo Brooks of Alabama, not Mel Brooks, but Mo Brooks, who I'm pretty sure he was one of the 17 back in back in the fall, but more important, he addressed the mob the morning of the attack on the Capitol and exhorted them with the words, "Today is the day when American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass, and we can do that on the way to the Capitol." And that's clear incitement to violence, and I feel we should condemn it. And I actually think that we'll get a pretty solid bipartisan majority, at least on that.
And again, your experience of working on human rights issues for so long abroad, before we get into kind of your personal experience after this resolution, just the importance of people might think, well, these are toothless measures to be passed in the House, right? Like you said, it doesn't really do anything to censure or to condemn. But what's the point of just putting people on the record, saying the words?
Yeah, leadership matters. And again, bringing it back to January 6th, you had thousands of people doing something that was completely deviant, right? I mean, attacking the United States Capitol, beating police officers to death, trying to kidnap members of Congress. And yet, virtually everybody in that crowd believed sincerely that what they were doing was patriotic. How did that happen? Who gave them that impression? It was leaders in this country validating that kind of behavior. And so I think it's really important, not sufficient, but necessary for leaders and leadership bodies like the Congress to consistently say, this is wrong.
So then what happened after the resolution? You were, you were in an election season, right? Up for re-election. Just talk about what happened next.
I was in a tough election in a swing district in New Jersey, running against a guy who wanted to be seen as a moderate Republican, but the National Republican Congressional Committee, which is their big national fundraising arm, started running an ad in my district that was basically a QAnon message that accused me of being a supporter, apologist of child sex traffickers, based on incredibly ridiculous, tenuous stuff. I used to work for Human Rights Watch, a human rights organization that once, many years ago, lobbied against a crime bill that had some provisions on the National Sex Offender Registry. But out of that, they manufactured this dark, scary, and totally dishonest ad that basically was, and I think very consciously, playing to the QAnon conspiracy theory that there are powerful people in government, particularly Democrats, who are in league with sex traffickers. And they ran that ad for over a month. They put over $1 million behind it. It was denounced all over the country by fact checkers as 100% false and inflammatory, and yet they stuck with it. And eventually, I got a Q drop out of it. So the Q persona, not a real person, of course, but the persona that is at the heart of the Q fantasy, posted about me and linked to the Republican Party's ad as that was their footnote, that was their citation to prove the attack that they then launched against me. And then I started getting death threats from QAnon supporters called into my office.
Wow.
Yeah.
And just to be really, really clear, because I'm just super fascinated, and I think it's important for people to understand too, how a kernel of something, right, can become something else, how it can grow into a falsehood, right? So it wasn't even, I was reading about this last night, it wasn't even you at Human Rights Watch who had written a policy position or had given a quote somewhere, about this crime bill that included language about the sex offender registry. I believe that's what it is. Am I wrong about this?
Yeah.
That is the kernel of fact that then gave way to this whole other accusation. Is that right? I just want to make sure we're clear.
Well, because again, it fits into a pre-existing conspiracy theory.
Right.
The central QAnon theory that there is a cabal of powerful people hidden within the government. Of course, they're generally, when named, they are prominent Jewish figures in our society. and that they are stealing your children, that they are, again, it's the blood libel. And so they managed to fit me into that. And they knew it was nonsense and bogus, but I think they also knew that there was this had been seeded, the field had been seeded by the QAnon conspiracy theory, so that millions of people were susceptible to this, but could believe it if presented to them, and they took advantage of that. And, the irony is I got some death threats. Now it's mostly my Republican colleagues who are getting death threats. This mob is much more angry at the supposed traitors in the Republican Party, from Mike Pence to Liz Cheney on down.
Right.
They are even at Democrats.
And let's talk about that in a second, but I want to ask you a couple more questions. Again, this is when it's one thing for this to be in this online space that is clearly driven by conspiracy theory. This was the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. This is a mainstream organization. This is an organization that has a lot of money, that can afford to run an ad for a month. What did they have to say about this?
I confronted the head of the NRCC on the House floor, a congressman named Tom Emmer of Minnesota, and basically said, I'm getting death threats because of a false ad that you guys are running. And he just threw up his hands and said, we're not responsible for what people do with our ads, and walked away.
Mm-hmm. So not acknowledging that this is some kind of call out to, ideas of the conspiracy theorists.
No, and they doubled down, because there was a lot of press coverage. The Washington Post fact checker gave it 4 Pinocchios. It was denounced by our local media in New Jersey, and they doubled down. They actually produced a new version of the ad and put it up that basically said the same thing. So
wow.
That was sad to me, that they felt like this, they obviously made a calculated decision that this would help them in some way. And it ended up being a very close election. I'm glad I beat them, right? Because then I could say it didn't work, but it almost worked. And I do worry that they may draw the wrong lessons from that experience. Right.
And you weren't the only one. There were other candidates who had similar ads made about them. Am I wrong about that?
That's right. And that's what really convinced me that it was a pattern, that there was a conscious decision by the NRCC to take advantage of the field that QAnon had seeded.
Yeah. And yet there's this sort of plausible deniability. We're like, well, we don't have control over what QAnon conspiracists are going to think or do. We're not, right? There's this, you can still create this space between what you're suggesting in an ad and the extremists.
Yes.
And that reminds me, I have to say, of many places I've been outside the United States, right? Where you have sort of a violent militia, basically, that has extremist beliefs, and you have kind of the politicians, seated in places of government, saying, well, we don't know what they do, but at the same time, saying things in public and doing things in the public sphere that then might encourage the violence. Have you made that connection before too? And how does that, how does that sit in your head?
Yeah, we've seen this all over the world. It's the oldest tactic in the book, right? It's encouraging or tolerating extremism, particularly extremism that targets minority groups, religious or ethnic minorities, and then taking advantage of it politically without ever joining the cuckoo party yourself. So that was the game that they were playing for months. They were sort of feeding this beast, hoping to tame this beast, maybe trying to use the energy of the beast, and now the beast is feeding on them, which was predictable, but somehow we'll make that mistake in history again and again and again.
And will feed on whoever it finds. I mean, let's be clear, the enemy on any given day, you don't know, right? But
well, it's hang Mike Pence.
Right now, that's what I'm saying is that's what's true today. What's true in a few weeks. And again, we'll talk about that too. Do you mind if we talk a little bit about January 6th and where you were and what the day was like for you? Knowing what you know and having gone through what you had gone through, right? So you have now become very familiar with these folks, how they think, and the fact that they're willing to outright threaten a sitting member of Congress based on a false claim. Right. So you're already there. And we all, had seen the rallies in November, the rally in December. Of course, we can all say very clearly now that people were telegraphing to the world what they were planning to do. What was your mindset the morning of January 6th when you woke up that morning? What did you think the day was going to be?
I thought it was going to be great. I thought, we were going to witness a kind of sad struggle within the Republican Party to come to terms with reality, that that's where the tensions were going to be, just within their caucus, but that we were going to see the American people in the world were going to see our system working in certifying the results of a free and fair election. And then, I was in the House chamber, in the gallery, watching the proceedings. Wanted to be part of that historic moment. And we knew that there was a crowd gathering outside. I would step out every once in a while to look out the windows. It seemed like a pretty big and scary crowd, but I remember reassuring my colleagues that this is going to be okay. We're in a fortress, and I'm sure that they're prepared for this. We have well-armed, well-trained security forces, only a few doors. It's going to be fine. And then we're in the chamber, and Nancy Pelosi gets taken out, and by her security, the leadership are removed by their security. We obviously were nervous from that point on, because then they shut us in. And we try to continue with the session. The Capitol Police start frantically running around the chamber trying to lock the doors. They don't have keys to the doors. It's clear they don't really know what's going on or what to do. And that's when people started getting very, very nervous. We hear banging on the doors and all kinds of sounds outside. Then we are asked to take out our gas masks, which are found under the chairs in the House chamber. Each of the gas masks has a mechanism that makes it make a kind of siren sound. And so you have 100 sirens going off.
Oh.
And the House chaplain stood up at the microphone and started praying, which was her job, but created an atmosphere in my mind of impending doom. And then, we made our way out through a door that turned out to be safe, and most of us didn't actually see the rioters. So we didn't, in that moment, we didn't actually see much of what we've now since seen on all of these videos. It was a lot worse than we were aware of in that moment. I was just thinking, you know what, this is crazy, and the sort of thing I might have experienced on trips to Libya or Egypt or Bahrain in my past life. And it's very hard to imagine going through this now in the Capitol building in Washington. But maybe this is the wake-up call that we need.
Mm-hmm. So that's what was going through your mind at the time?
At the moment, yes. Now we're going to get serious as a result of this. Because nobody can, this is not just online anymore. We're learning that what happens online happens in the real world. And so there was just a sense of determination building up inside of me at that moment. And the first thing that we were all determined to do, as I'm sure you noticed, was to finish our job that day. The moment we got the all clear, the moment that blood literally was wiped off the floor, we went back into that chamber. We certified the election. And so in a way, the day ended the way I had hoped, with that message to the world, that we're not going to be intimidated in any way from doing our jobs.
Yeah. Then, of course, we saw a lot of threats about what could happen in the days leading up to the inauguration, not just in DC, but in state capitals. I think, like you said, it was a wake-up call for law enforcement. You saw buildings being fortified all over the country. Those days went by smoothly. That doesn't mean that it's over. What is your gut? Like, what do you think will happen next?
We're playing offense. That's good. And we saw in just 2 weeks what playing offense can do. I hate these fences that are going up around buildings. It's necessary, but I hate it. I want law enforcement to be out there making arrests, conducting investigations, monitoring the online traffic of these basically domestic terrorist groups. I want to see civil lawsuits, and I want to see the online companies finally doing their part in dampening the spread of these online conspiracy theories and recruitment to hate groups. And so I think we know what to do. There's going to be a dangerous period because in any counterterrorism action, you're going to, the first step is to take down the mass movement, which is what this was. But then as you do that, it fragments, and the remaining elements may end up being the most radical and the most violent. And there may be a period when you have local cells doing things locally on their own. But I think that's a necessary stage that we have to go through until we bury this as much as it can be buried. And we've done that before. I mean, there have been several times in American history when we've had to take down the KKK when it was a mass movement. And, well, we're going to do it again.
When they tell you who they are, believe them.
Yes.
And we've waxed and waned between taking them seriously and not taking them seriously. What specifically can Congress do in this moment? I know you said that it's important to say the words out loud, to consistently condemn. That's one piece of it. What else can Congress do in this moment to get at some of the things that you're talking about?
Yeah. So obviously we're now working with a unified government. The Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security are not going to be held back by the White House anymore. So we're going to make sure they have the resources and authorities that they need. We want to make sure it doesn't go too far either. I don't want an overreaction as we saw after 9/11. I just want to use the strength and resources that our law enforcement agencies have. I think they probably have most of the legal authorities they need to go after people who are up to no good. The other piece that I'm focused on is the social media space and online radicalization and the responsibilities that these private companies have for what has happened in America and in so many other countries that have become beset by violent extremism and political polarization over the last 10 years. It's a complicated problem, but that's going to be my priority over the coming months.
Do you believe deplatforming works?
Yes, but I think it's the easy way out too. It's the thing, we debate it because we can all understand it. Everybody understands the idea of something bad was posted on Twitter, maybe it should be taken down, or maybe not. Like, that's a debate we can all engage in. But that's not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is how these social networks are designed deliberately, consciously, to tear us apart, to divide us, to push us into our respective ideological corners. Here's the analogy I would give you. Imagine you're some young person and in the United States and you click on a video that a friend posted that says that Democrats plus Hugo Chavez plus the deep state sex trafficking cabal conspired to steal the election from Donald Trump and give it to Joe Biden. You watch that video, and a minute later, your phone rings. You pick up the phone, and the voice says, "Hey, Kelly, it's Freddie from Facebook. And we couldn't help but notice that you just watched a really cool video about how Hugo Chavez and the Democrats and the sex traffickers stole the election from Donald Trump. Here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to send you links to 20 more really interesting videos that'll help you explore your interest in this incredibly important theory. And as a bonus, we're going to send you the phone numbers of maybe a couple dozen really cool people on the internet who you might want to get to know and maybe do stuff together with to explore this newfound interest of yours." If Facebook did that, we'd be pretty pissed off, don't you think? But that's exactly what they do. That's how the algorithm works. And it works automatically because it knows everything about us, what we like, what we hate, what we fear. And it feeds us increasingly extreme versions of all of those things, because that's what keeps us glued to our platforms, to the screens, the longest, so that we see more ads and buy more stuff. That's, I think, the fundamental, that's not one explanation, but that is probably the most fundamental explanation of what's gone wrong.
So how do you undo that? How do you make it right?
So, there's a lot of debate about liability for social media companies. Section 230, the infamous or famous Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, says they're not responsible for anything we post. I can sue you for defaming me on Twitter, but I can't sue Twitter. And some people want to get rid of it altogether. Trump wanted to get rid of it for totally weird reasons. We can talk about that separately. But I've introduced legislation that would remove Section 230 protections from content on the big platforms if it is promoted, amplified, recommended by their algorithms, and it can be connected to very severe real-world harm, acts of terrorism, violent hate crimes by groups that act against civil rights. There are statutes, the existing civil statutes, under which you can sue people for those things. And so this legislation would basically subject them to liability. And the goal would be not just to punish them, that's not ultimately the goal, but to incentivize changes to the design of their networks, to diminish this echo chamber effect. We sent a letter to Facebook, Twitter, and Google a couple weeks ago, myself and a whole bunch of members of the House, asking for specific changes, which we know that they're capable of making. And just yesterday, Facebook made one of the changes, or said that it would make one of the changes we asked for, which is to stop recommending through their algorithm joining political and social issue groups. This was one of the drivers of this. So one small change that we got just in the last couple of weeks. But we need to see much deeper change.
I mean, how much do you feel like you're going to see a willingness on the part of the tech companies to make those changes?
I'm skeptical that they'll do it absent pressure from legislation. And I think, if they are suddenly liable, like they actually have to defend themselves in court, then I think they have an incentive to make changes so they can go to, inevitably they'll be sued and they'll want to make a case. And they're going to want to be able to say to judges, Your Honor, yeah, this was a problem, but here's how we have redesigned the network, not to eliminate it, because you never can, but to make things significantly better. I'll give you another example of something Facebook did temporarily, which was really interesting. They ran an experiment with some subset of their users where they asked those users to rank every single post in their newsfeed, whether that post was good for the world or bad for the world. And then the algorithm learned what everybody thought was good or bad for the world. And it adjusted what they saw on their news feed to make it nicer, make it more in tune with what people thought was good. And the result was a nice news feed. There was less disinformation, less hate, less anger, more NPR and the New York Times, and I assume cute kitten videos and nice stuff like that. So it was great. It was really successful, except for one thing. Those very people spent less time on the platform, even though they were getting what they thought, what they had said was good for the world. Because human nature, right? I mean,
it's boring.
What we obsess with our hates and our fears, right? That's what, and so, the bottom line is that their algorithm, all these companies, their algorithms are based on maximizing engagement, getting people to stay online the longest and to click more things. And as long as that's the fundamental basis for the design of these networks, you're going to have QAnon, you're going to have political polarization, you're going to have conspiracy theories. The right will go further right, the left will go further left. And we're going to need to decide whether that's okay or not. I think it's not okay.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been hearing so much, especially in the last few days when we're discussing, moving forward with impeachment is, let's unify, let's put our partisan fighting aside, and I think it's important to talk about this, to try to talk about this not as a partisan issue. It has become such a partisan issue. How do we do that? How do we rise above it as this notion that it is a partisan thing?
Yeah, well, nobody likes consequences when they're the ones facing the consequences, right? A lot of the let bygones be bygones talk is not on the level, because I see in, say, the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate, when it comes to the insurrection or things that Trump did, they want to move on, but then they're going after Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and we have members of the House going into the districts of these fellow Republicans to campaign against them, get them defeated. Resolutions censuring Cindy McCain. And so I don't think they themselves are practicing what they preach. They're just going after the good guys rather than allowing us to go after the bad guys. So, there have to be, in my view, some consequences here, and the unity that we should be striving towards, and I really do believe that's an appropriate concept, has to be unity around the rule of law. It has to be unity around telling the truth, unity in rejecting violence. Not unity in the sense that Republicans have to become less Republican or conservatives have to become less conservative, but unity around those concepts. And so I think that's what Biden means. That's certainly what I mean when I talk about it. And it requires a degree of consequence for those who just violate basic standards of decency. And then, the online stuff, I think one of the positive aspects of the bill that I've proposed is that it's content neutral, it's ideology neutral. It doesn't go after, conservatives on Twitter, for example. It goes after a design feature of the social networks that empowers extreme voices on every side. So let's say you believe that Antifa is a bigger problem than QAnon. I think that's crazy, but if you believe that, you should support my legislation, because the same thing that drives recruitment to QAnon also drives recruitment to extreme groups on the left. And so I'm hoping that will be something that we can rally around.
Outrage scrolling goes both ways. Yeah. Thank you so much, Congressman Malinowski. I really appreciate you talking and letting me just sort of walk you through some of the darker days of the last few months of your life and some of the things we can do about what's happening. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Rose.
Thank you. And thank you both for taking the time and what was a really wide-ranging and interesting conversation. I hope that we can have you back as conversations develop over the next year on how to respond to this issue, both in terms of tech extremism and American democracy. So thank you for giving the time. We'll release you back to your days, but hope that many of you will stick around now. For the second part of today's event, I'm excited to welcome a panel of experts to walk us through the long evolution of extremism in online spaces, what happened on January 6th, and where things might go from here. As I walk us through that, I want to first introduce Shereen Mitchell, a technologist and founder of Stop Online Violence Against Women and an organization called Digital Sistas, which was the first organization to focus on the status of women and girls of color in digital media and technology. Shereen is a leading voice on disinformation and race in the United States and has a breadth of experience tracking the real world impact of extremism and white nationalism online. We're also lucky to have several experts from the DFRLab itself today, including Graham Brookie, who is the director of the lab and a former advisor to the White House Homeland Security and National Security Advisors. We have Emerson Brooking, who is a resident senior fellow at DFRLab and a co-author of a book called Like War, which was one of the earliest works on the weaponization of social media. And finally, we have Jared Holt, who's a visiting research fellow and one of the leading researchers of right-wing extremist movements, specializing in their communities online. After a discussion with our panelists, we will open up the conversation to questions from the audience. So if you are joining us today through Zoom and have questions, please do use the Q&A function there. You don't have to wait. You can start posing questions as we're talking, and we will try to get to them towards the end. And with that introduction, I want to start this off by turning to Graham. For the past several months, the DFRLab has closely watched the online activity of extremist communities, working alongside civil society and government partners to assess and respond to threats developing. Could you tell us a bit about what DFRLab has been doing and how it came to these issues in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely, Rose. So thanks so much for that introduction. That basically covers it. I mean, part of our job at the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council is to track the nexus, or to look at the nexus between online harms and the causal direct impact that they have here in the real world. So part of that work is to identify, expose, and explain disinformation. Part of that work is to look at the evolution and trends of radicalization and extremism online. Part of that work is to make policy recommendations on where do we go from here. But all of that work is to guard and promote this kind of shared set of facts that democracy or free and open societies depend on. And so the events of January 6th, for instance, are all those things coming to a head. But a couple quick points. One, we've tracked this type of material all over the world. We do that on a day-to-day basis. We have a global team that's spread out across 5 continents, and it's not just here in the United States. Two is that this work doesn't begin and end with one event. The events on January 6th had a long lead up to it, which I think we're going to discuss here today. And they didn't end on January 6th either. There's going to be a long tail of this radicalization, all these kind of extremist groups on one end of the spectrum of radicalization, to hardcore conspiracy adherents, to outright racist groups or groups that are coordinated and based in longstanding racism, to general enthusiasts about overall political ideologies. And so that all of those kind of things that come together across various parts of the internet but converge around an event like January 6th or an insurrection like what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, they have a long shelf life and a long half-life that we're going to be dealing with in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. If I can turn to Emerson to continue on that, could you give us a bit of a background on the foundation and buildup in the months before the US Capitol attack, how the groups that mobilized to Washington, D.C. used technology to create the digital infrastructure that supported their efforts?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly. So the lead up to the January 6th attack begins actually shortly before the 2020 election. With already before the election, there was a hashtag Stop the Steal. There was a deep sense among supporters of President Trump that there was election fraud going on. We at the DFRLab were monitoring voting-related disinformation, and we felt it was almost like seeds that were being planted. Certain stories or decontextualized videos and images that might be used to call the election into doubt if the outcome didn't go in the direction that President Trump wanted. And that turned out to be the case. So in the days after the election, then there was this building fury, and there were, demonstrations outside the Maricopa, Arizona elector's office. There were protests throughout November and December, and there was just a growing disenchantment that the outcome of the 2020 election had been the target of a conspiracy. What was interesting in the online mobilization element here was that a lot of folks had been previously engaged in anti-mask protests or conspiratorial movements related to COVID-19 denialism. In fact, in the days after the election, there was a group which reached millions of members, a Facebook group Stop the Steal, which had essentially just rebranded itself from an anti-mask cause. So then as we begin to approach January 6th, we have different communities with different focuses, some conspiratorial, some like QAnon focused, but they all have a general sense that the election has been stolen. And then January 6th becomes a kind of day of prophecy, because that's the day that the electoral votes are going to be certified. And that's the day where they want to be present at the moment in order to see President Trump overturn the purportedly false election and realize his second term.
Thank you. And Jared, in a somewhat related question, prior to the attack on January 6th, there's a convergence of quite a few different groups which share extreme but distinct beliefs around the notion of a rigged election, as Emerson noted, as well as a series of other issues unrelated to the election itself. Could you provide a rundown of the prominent groups that were involved, what they aimed to achieve, how they organized, and frankly, even beyond just the January 6th or election-related target, how they differ from each other in organization and disposition?
Right. So the groups that we saw attack the Capitol on January 6th came from a few different flavors of extremism. You had some participants who come from a white nationalist, white supremacist vein of extremism. You had some militia movement groups coming from that vein of extremism. You had conspiracy theorists, and you had, just a whole bunch of run-of-the-mill Trump supporters that were along for the ride. And what made that possible is that, the infrastructure and the planning for the attack on the Capitol had happened online in plain sight. The lines that typically separate those groups of extremists from one another, in the ways that they differ for the kind of American society they would try to implement if they gained any sort of democratic power, or just the line generally between, hardcore militia people who want violence and run-of-the-mill Trump supporters. It just got super blurred right there. And something to point out is that before the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, these groups had been coming together already at, election centers, vote counting centers, and state capitals every single weekend since the election leading up to January 6th. So really, we saw this coming from a mile away. What was happening in the immediate weeks before the attack on the Capitol was the volume and the intensity of the rhetoric was heating up. And there was also a very significant presence of logistical planning, which gave us a really strong indication that that rhetoric wasn't just keyboard talk. It was something that was going to materialize in a potentially dangerous way. So when all of those groups came together, their ideological differences were kind of put to the side, and they were united with, connected with this broader, cohesion of election disinformation and conspiracy theories. And, for all the culture war or different agenda items they might have wanted, at the end of the day, what brought them all together is that they wanted Trump, and they wanted to do something to interfere with with the democratic process to make that possible.
I want to follow up with you in a moment about some of the platforms that they were organizing on and how that shifted over time. But a quick related question for Graham, if you could speak a bit to, Jared alluded to a coalescence around the mission of ensuring that Donald Trump could remain in office regardless of the outcome of the election. Can you speak a bit to what we saw shifting in political leadership, responding to these groups and engaging with these groups over the course of time that you've been monitoring this?
That's a good question. There's a big difference between what we saw in before January 6th and then what we saw after January 6th. I mean, I think that one of the things that Representative Malinowski hit on extremely eloquently and very usefully earlier in this conversation is the responsibility that not only elected leaders, but public officials, people with large public platforms or positions of trust in our society have in leading on this problem, right? Leading on this challenge. And so the rhetoric, as we've been monitoring, shifted pretty drastically directly after the events, the insurrection that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. One of the most useful things that frankly I've heard in the entire time that we've been working on this set of issues, or that I've been working on this set of issues, was the floor speech by a member of the Republican Party on the evening of January 6th as they got back to work and actually certified the results of the election. It's very difficult for us to call this a peaceful transition of power at this point, but certified the transition of power that evening. And that was Senator Mitt Romney, where he got up and said the highest degree of respect that you can have for an individual, especially a constituent, is to tell them the truth. And that's the starting point here. And if it's not the starting point, then we're shooting off in a very, very dangerous direction, again, for the shared set of facts that our democracy depends on.
Absolutely. Shereen, if I can turn to you for a moment, you spent your career steeped in the internet and its online communities, spaces that can be notoriously homogenous and hostile to women and people of color. Can you help us understand the events of January 6th in the context of the longer evolution of extremism in online spaces, and certainly share a bit about your experience as someone who has found themselves on the receiving end of many of these groups' violence and harassment yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Again, thank you for having me. So the thing that I want to make sure that we understand about this is that there's an underpinning of this that is key to why we ended up with January 6th. It's not just the elections, right? I think that there's some pieces here that people disconnect about, and that is, this was also a reaction to what happened on January 5th, where Black women changed the election in Georgia, and that targeting of that particular group is also part of the reason that we got to January 6th. So it was like we couldn't celebrate, right? Black people were not able to celebrate what was classified and an impossible outcome because no one could expect that could or would happen. But it's also a history of this country about certain people of color having any power or any decisions over laws, elections, legislation, and the like. That's a long-term thing. We can go all the way back to Jim Crow to some extent for much of this behavior because it's not gone. But I do want to go back in the whole framework of this and even include the key pieces that even the platforms have participated in. And that is, when I tell people all the time that the easiest thing that I was able to do when I formed Digital Sisters was to get the girls to code. The fact that people didn't think like girls like me could code, I taught myself to code at 10 years old, was that there was this key sense of like, this is only one lane for one group of people and that no one else should have space in that has been going on forever. It's been going on for me as early as 10. So I'm not 10 now. There's some age going on here. So we're talking decades of this behavior and it's always been in this space. But what wasn't being spoken about is the impacts and why those impacts mattered and what those impacts could lead to. And so when I formed Stop Online Violence Against Women, I specifically focused on what was happening to women of color, in particular Black women, so that I can tell that story and that narrative, and that they also could tell the story and the narrative themselves. But the reason that we're having this problem, and the reason that we are not understanding it, is that we're still not getting back to the root cause. We're still not having the conversation about why this happened. This is about the not only changing demographics of this country, but that there is a that there is a clear acceptance or a clear expectation that the minority group who should have control over the political rule it should be and should always be white and male, and that anything in between that shifts, that's a problem and it needs to be shut down. And if that shutdown means violence and equates to violence, then fine, which is what we saw on January 6th. But I want to go back to some of the original issues here about the online space, and that is the way in which the platforms did not care or even deplatform, because we always talk, like everyone wants to talk about the deplatforming of I have a name for him, but the person who was officially in office, who's no longer there, is that, I was deplatformed from YouTube in 2009. I was deplatformed because I was speaking up about the lack of diversity in issues in the tech industry. And so for me to be deplatformed, who's the voice trying to shift a narrative that we have problems with for at least 10 years, almost a decade, there are plenty of other voices, not just mine, that was also being deplatformed, banned and suspended because we were speaking up against the racism and the injustices against us. And the platforms were fine with silencing us. And as people keep talking about this conservative bias, what they're saying is they should have the right to say whatever they want, even if that incites violence against us. But us defending ourselves is considered more violent than them, which is why you stop us before. So before you get to the conspiracy theories, before that becomes a populist framework, you've already silenced the people that could have countered it. And we have fundamentally not accepted that reality. And until we do, this problem will continue. And it will evolve in different ways because that's all that happens with that. But as long as there's some quote unquote concept that my voice trying to stop this is equal to the people who, because of free speech, is equal to the people who are inflicting harms, then we are fundamentally not having the same conversations.
You bring up a really important and interesting point that I'd like to have Jared, Emerson, Graham, either any of you expand on, which is that these kind of conversations and movements don't exist in isolation. And so while there is certainly, a conversation to be had about growing white nationalism online and the organizing that has happened through that, connecting to what we experienced on January 6th, it's also in reaction to a series of different conversations about who has space online, who gets to make decisions about content and space online, and what that means for society. So I wonder, Jared, I know you've been tracking these groups for a long time, but if you can speak just to where these conversations meet and perhaps double onto each other.
Like Shireen said, as I said earlier, a lot of these groups have different specific agenda items, specific visions for America, but they do share a core of, central grievances. And a lot of it does boil down to wanting to hold and maintain power over a country that is changing. And, understanding that motivation and understanding that is what sort of unites right-wing extremism in a broader sense is really crucial because, like Shireen said, unless you hit the core cause, you're not really fixing the problem. You can deplatform here, moderate there, but until you really approach it on a fundamental, foundational level, lasting change is not going to happen.
So if I can lift that up and ask Emerson, we've referred to January 6th as a failed insurrection. How are the groups that were involved and the individuals who were involved in that event viewing the outcome of that day and their efforts leading up to it?
So I think for most people who showed up to the Capitol on January 6th or showed up to Washington, D.C., the public backlash has come as a surprise. After the Capitol was occupied, I briefly just went down to Freedom Plaza in DC to try to overhear some of the conversations among people who had been part of this event. And for them, it was a general sense of victory that they'd done it. But they were wondering why Trump wasn't president again. And they were really wondering what came next. And I think for people who were hardcore supporters of President Trump, even if they were under extraordinary delusions, we have an opportunity now to kind of pull them back to reality. But for a smaller subset, I worry that January 6th might be the start of a next phase of far-right extremism in this country. Because images and video of people storming the US Capitol, of overcoming Capitol police officers, has extraordinary propaganda value. It was a truly spectacular attack. And if you think about the core of this movement, the way you might think about other extremist groups around the world, images and video here are going to have lasting propaganda and recruitment value. And it's my great fear that for the next generation of far-right extremists, for people who weren't there, they're going to look at this content and wish that they were. And they will aspire in the months and years to come to be the perpetrators of the next such attack. And I also worry that under a Biden administration, whatever connection many of this hardcore group had to the US government is gone. So violence in the future, I think, will be much more expressly anti-state. And for the people who remain in these groups, they'll feel more like the gloves are off.
Thank you. Graham, if I can turn to you real quick to ask, obviously everyone has a response, but what do we do about this? And there's a conversation that we can have, and we'll get to in a bit, about platforms' responsibility and engagement itself. But there's certainly a growing conversation about the role of government and the role of Congress in responding. I'm curious if you can speak a bit to what is the overview of those conversations right now? How is that playing out with legislators? And whether we're talking about explicit responses to extremism itself, whether online or offline, or conversations about engaging with platforms themselves, where do you see that policy conversation going over the next year?
Well, I think to build on an important point that Emerson just laid out, again, the events on January's, and to build on a point that Shireen pointed out, that the extremely relevant historical context for it. If you look at over the last year, the groups, when we look at the pictures that are now seared into the American canon from January 6th, we see one group, right? But the reality of it is that they were a bunch of different groups that coalesced around a specific narrative and a specific event. And those groups coordinate on different, or engage with each other in different places online. But over the last year, what we've seen is compounding crisis events or upheaval around the literal pandemic. We're all having this event on Zoom because we're not at our office to have an in-person gathering, right? We've had overwhelmingly peaceful racial justice protests over the last year. We've had backlash to those overwhelmingly peaceful racial justice protests. We've had a wildly contested election, which is the basis of this conversation. And so we've had compounding crisis events. And what we've seen online is a bunch of these different groups that are at varying points along this spectrum of radicalization coalesce and sometimes discover each other, engage with each other for the first time ever, right? You look at protests previously this summer around the reopen movement in response to COVID-19 pandemic. And there were a bunch of groups from varying degrees, like drastically different parts of the political spectrum in the United States that kind of discovered each other, but engage with conspiracy theories on a pretty consistent basis. And so you look at all of these groups and you say, where do we go from here, right? And that spectrum of radicalization, again, you have everything from like the very furthest end of violent extremism, right? Unlawful militias, groups that are actively calling for a second civil war, actively calling for violence, with a high degree of command and control and active degrees of coordination, right? That don't live in the most open places on the internet. You have groups that are explicitly racist and explicitly violent, but not necessarily unlawful militias, groups like the Proud Boys, and they have a high degree of command and control, coordination. Then you have widespread conspiracy adherence, what BuzzFeed News now calls a collective delusion, and that's QAnon, what we were talking about in the last session. And that's kind of ubiquitous online, that's everywhere online. It has coded language that evolves a lot of the time. And then you have, white nationalist groups, you have more extreme political ideologies that are kind of converging. And all of those groups are converging right now and discovering each other online. And that's a drastically large problem. And so if you're in the government right now, there's a lot of good ideas. We heard a lot of good ideas in the last session about what Congress is going to do or needs to go do. I would expect that you'll see a commission that's started around the events of January 6th itself. There's a question of whether it'll be explicitly and narrowly focused on the failings of the Capitol Police and the ability to guard the Capitol itself, or whether it'll be about this set of issues, this broader set of issues that we're talking about today. I think you'll see a lot of legislation. The Biden administration has announced that they are doing some amount of a short-term sprint on how to deal with this across the entirety of the federal government, and this being domestic extremism explicitly. And they have a lot of options. But I think one of the things that we have to realize is that when we, again, go back and look at the photos, the group that was involved in the events of January 6th, there was a large, what we would call, former government folks would call insider threat. There were a lot of folks that in that group that serve in positions of power, either locally or at the state level or at the federal level, in the military. And that's an insider threat, right? You can't have people serving in government that don't believe in that government, that aren't actively supporting their oath or carrying out their oath of office, their oath to their position, their oath to their country. That's point number one, insider threat. And then what are the jurisdictions and the policy interventions that you have for overall de-radicalization for some of these ideologies that are not based in fact, that are detached from fact, this is conspiracy groups. And so I think that there's a lot that will happen across the interagency and the executive branch. I think that there's a lot that'll happen in Congress. I think that you'll pull in some of this tech stuff, right? What to do with things like Section 230, what to do with algorithmic transparency, especially as it pertains to domestic conversations. And I think that's generally a good thing. But all of that is based in taking a hard look in the mirror at ourselves as Americans to figure out what it is that we all believe in and brings us together.
Thank you. I want to turn to Shireen for one more question, and then we're going to start pulling in some questions from the audience. As Graham just spoke through the public sector response, I'm curious, Shireen, what you think in the private sector, what measures social media platforms could take to prevent or limit violent white nationalists from abusing their services, or to limit the harm to communities most affected by their ire? What gaps you see in policy or enforcement that could make a difference?
So, I mean, I want to say that there are policies, I think, that are not being implemented that we can use. There's digital public space policies and laws that should be implemented. There's some in California. I think there's a couple other states that have that, and we need like a 50-state perspective on this. And I say that to make sure people understand. I don't see this just as a federal answer. There needs to be a local answer to this, because the reason that people who are getting attacked have no outlet to address much of this is because if someone is being attacked in New York and a person is in Florida, then who's responsible? Like who they don't have the police force, and also be clear, not to say that the police force is friendly to people of color in this regard in any form, but that there are issues here that we're not looking at. And I want to also back up a little bit in terms of like some of the public stuff that I think that doesn't get talked about enough, like swatting, for example. There needs to be state level responses to that, as well as federal laws that federal legislation. We've worked with other, with different members in Congress about some of these laws that just never went anywhere. And we need to think about that going forward. And I just want to have that as a public frame that still needs to be worked out, because we still aren't there. I mean, the debate over Section 230 to me is not the debate that we need to have. I think the debate that we need to be having is the debate over how do we protect people who are being targeted from online violence, and how to go about that. The other pieces that I think that we should be focusing on is the work that we do is focus on digital voter suppression, which is looking at voter suppression not just from the lens of the physical piece, but the lens from the digital piece. And as I speak to that, I just want to make sure that people understand that some of these campaigns, even Stop the Steal, started in 2016 with Russia. That's a hashtag campaign. Just like Walk Away was a hashtag campaign that led up to an actual organization led by, a white dude who's basically saying, we're trying to help Black people not vote for Democrats because politics for you should be different because X, Y, Z. The fact that people didn't understand that they were, which is our first report, not only Russia was targeting us, the campaigns were targeting us, presidential campaigns. And we've seen this sort of morphing into acceptance that we as the voters are being targeted as people of color, and somehow it's just politics as usual. until we get over that's a fundamental flaw into what got us to January 6th as well. I've seen not only Democrat campaigns do this, I've also seen conservative campaigns do this. And we know this because now people are saying, we know that what happened in 2016 was, deterrence, right? They're calling it deterrence of Black voters specifically. And until we understand the root cause of these things, we're never going to get there. So we tracked Walkaway all the way to Georgia. And until people are tracking what we're tracking, because we're tracking from the margin to get us to the story that needs to be had. And yet, even in media, that story is not being told. It's told in sort of a tangent. And we still elevate or highlight the conspiracy theorists. We elevate and highlight the Trump supporters. We do not highlight the people. We didn't even highlight the Black supporters when Obama won. We're still not doing it. Georgia happened and we're still not having those conversations. And that's part of the embed in allowing the conspiracy theories to take over what should be truthful narratives, because we're not even having the truthful narratives. We're still talking about those conspiracy theories. And so when I talk about where do we go from here, right? The case of people understanding about Gamergate, right? They understand Gamergate. Gamergate was a media conversation, but the target of Gamergate was a white woman. The target of Donglegate, which was before that, was a Black woman. Nobody wanted to talk about that. That was not a conversation to be had. So as this thing kept morphing and changing, there's still a conversation about Gamergate, of which I was also a target of, versus the things that were happening before that. And the person who was targeted in Donglegate was a Black woman speaking up about sexism in the tech industry. So the fundamental problem about these tech companies is that they don't see us as a user base that they should be concerned about protecting. They see the base of which, Facebook was one example where they actually added white nationalism to their moderation process until organizations told them that they shouldn't be doing that. And if you think that they're going to implement something that doesn't continue to protect those voices versus ours, their original moderation process was protecting white men over Black boys. It's baked in. And until we unbake that and acknowledge that, then the solves are not there. And until we understand how those things work and how they impact certain lives, we have more conversations about the people who are doing harm than we do about the victims who are being harmed. And that shift has to also happen. And until they can solve this.
I'm really glad you raised that, and particularly the story that you're mentioning obviously got new life this week with reports of a federal charges against the individual who was partially responsible for specifically targeting Black voters with disinformation campaigns online to try and suppress their vote, which we've actually gotten a few questions from the audience about foreign interference. And I'm encouraged that the questions are a bit more nuanced than in the past. When I think in 2016, anytime anything bad happened online, the immediate question was it a Russian bot? Which lacked some of the nuance of what you're referring to, which is finding the fault lines within society and amplifying them as a goal and a mechanism for foreign interference. So, I mean, for the panel as a whole, if you can speak a bit to, we've gotten one question about how foreign adversaries are feeding disinformation to amplify the racial divide, and others asking about specifically for January 6th, what you are and are not seeing in that space. But I don't want to lose the thread, Shireen, of what you're talking about, which is defining whose experience online is what we should be focused on, or problem solving around in terms of both public and private policy. I don't know who wants to take the question on foreign interference first.
I'll kick it off and then maybe pass it over to Emerson, who's worked deeply on this issue. I mean, the overarching thing, and this goes back to 2016 with catastrophically successful foreign interference attempts or malign foreign interference attempts through the kind of more narrowly tailored, equally ambitious, I would say, but less effective over the last 4 years, 2018 midterms in particular, is that it's opportunistic, right? There is no version of this conversation where we say all of these things that foreign interference is able to prey on were caused by, or there were narratives that were started or seeded by foreign actors, right? I would characterize, especially, for instance, Russia's activity targeting 2018 midterms as equal opportunity hyperpartisanship. They're not creating stuff and then kind of ballooning it into the United States. They're looking at social fault lines in the United States, these root issues, much to what Shireen was just talking about, and then preying on them, regardless of the tactic. We could have a day-long conversation about the tactics that are used and have been used to infiltrate various groups, use large-scale online manipulation to do X, Y, and Z, but it preys on social fault lines that are our responsibility. Emerson, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we look back at the 2016 Russian campaign, some of their most followed accounts did masquerade as African-American activists. If you look at Iranian influence efforts, they ran one of their biggest American targeted pages was Black Lives Matter News, although its news was almost exclusively about the good work that Hezbollah was doing in Lebanon. The thing, though, is that I think media coverage has lent too much effectiveness to these initiatives. In particular, right after 2016, there was such a focus on this African-American targeted messaging that it was a little bit, I thought, like othering. It exaggerated the issue. It infantilized some of the communities that they were talking about. And as time has gone on, I worry increasingly when we talk about the foreign interference targeting particular minority communities. It seems to sometimes be used as a crutch or a way to distract from deeper issues. Amid the George Floyd protests this year, there were a number of U.S. intelligence officials who spoke always off the record that foreign adversaries were targeting those protests and contributing disinformation. And I'm sure that was true to an extent, but there were never hard numbers to back it up. But what alarmed myself and my team when we were following coverage of this issue was that any story where an anonymous official said anything about disinformation and race, it would receive millions and millions of shares. And, if you were even, a good liberal observer of these issues, you could be led to believe that it was foreign actors that were responsible for a lot of the movement that was then sweeping the country. So I really feel like the foreign interference question in this context is not a very useful frame relative to other ways we can think about this.
Thank you. Shireen, did you have something you wanted to say on that?
Yes, I do. I just want to make sure that people understand it's not that the foreign interference did not exist or doesn't exist. And I think that there needs to be an understanding of that. One of the problems I had with these tech companies was that if it was foreign, that was something they were willing to take action over. But if it was domestic, they would not. And so the key to the problem isn't just about us and us being able to tell the narratives of the story. It's the way in which other people talk about us. They talk about us without us being present to be able to sort of elaborate and give a deeper depth and breadth to what's really going on. And that has been solely problematic in this. And I'm glad you guys are inviting me to speak because that's part of this. If we're not here in the conversation, then there's nuances that will get missed. However, I just want to also make sure that we understand is that what happened in 2016 was started and seeded by foreign action, but domestic actors picked that up and ran with it. And that's what we're dealing with. And instead of us dealing with that part, is that the call is coming from inside the house. The disinformation was coming from inside the house. Once he was removed and banned, the disinformation dropped by 70%. But you have to think about how many years of that is acceptable from certain groups of people or certain users who have a following because you want because companies like the churn of that kind of response and call and response without caring at all about the impact of the people who are being impacted or targeted by those same individuals. And I'll say this again. I'll go back to the fact that if you're banning and suspending Black and brown people on Facebook for saying white people, we're not having the same conversation when you won't do that for white people who are saying go out and kill, which was a report that we did last year, shoot them all. The shoot them all content is not being removed. But if Black and brown people say, white people, we're banned and suspended. Anything that we say in that format or anything underneath that, that gets couched in the same conversation, and it's not. And I say this very candidly to also say the N-word is fine if white people are saying it, but we can't say white people. And the equivalence of free speech in the context of that protection is also pieces that we're not talking about. And then I just want to make sure that we understand the part that I'm trying to get here is when it's us, when it's Americans, we use free speech as the cudgel for this permission. We use free speech as the cudgel to say that people can incite violence. We're still listening to versions of that, even as politicians use that as the weapon. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what Russia did in 2016. They used the weapon of free speech against us, so we would battle over that instead of what's actually going on. And we're still doing it.
Absolutely.
My free speech is not protected more than the white man's free speech.
And that I actually want to bring in a question from the audience related to what we're talking about here, where we've been discussing some of these trends specifically in relationship to expression on social media. But one of the audience members notes correctly that traditional media, television, radio, newspapers play a role in, and Emerson, you alluded to this, in giving credence, credibility, defining what the narrative is. I'm wondering, we have about 5 minutes left, so if we can do a quick response on this question and then make sure we all have time to close out, what you have to say about options we have and where the conversation can go about the information space as a whole in addressing these issues. And I'll go to Graham first because he looks ready to jump on this.
Well, I think not to not answer the question, but we're going to have a couple of reports that go directly at this with regard to what we've been looking at over the course of the 2020 election cycle. And so we think about this as a collective responsibility, and groups or institutions in our society that have a huge amount of responsibility for this are government, media, and tech. And civil society, which is the category that we all kind of fall into, and citizens themselves, of course. And so, which interventions do each one of those groups have? You're going to see a lot of churn from government on this. You have seen a lot of churn from government on this. On the social media companies, they've built up a huge amount of muscle memory policies that deal with things like coordinated and authentic behavior, etc. And that's generally a good thing, right? Like, we've made progress on this set of issues, but I think much to Shireen's point, right? Like, we don't get to pick and choose the online harms that we have to go deal with. We don't get to prioritize which ones are going to be more important to a basic rule of law, justice, fairness, equality, the things that we as a society say that we value, right? And so we have to go figure that out. And social media companies are going to have a huge role to play in that, an outsized role to play in that. With regard to media, we've seen pretty consistently, and I think generally a good trend on this is you take case studies like WikiLeaks in 2016 that had a huge amount of coverage and had a huge amount of mainstream impact, right? People saying, that's very curious after they read an article in a large outlet. Compared to stories that were based in disinformation, like the Hunter Biden laptop stories, over this election cycle. And that was covered in a lot different way, a lot more skeptical of a way. It wasn't taken as face value and reported as such by the broadest swath of media outlets, especially mainstream media outlets. And so I think that that's generally progress, that's resilience against unverified at best stories. But there's a huge, we have a long, long way to go, which I think is probably good for the folks that are on this call in particular. It means that we have some job security, we have some things to think through, but it's a huge vulnerability for society.
Thank you. And cognizant that we're unfortunately a minute to the end of time, I just want to say a last few words, picking up some of the questions from our audience that we didn't get to, as an invitation to please continue following us and join us for what we hope to be a series of future conversations covering all of these issues. We've had questions about what our approach to these challenges means for the EU conversation happening, about platform regulation in markets. We've had questions about disinformation for profit as an industry, which dovetails into a much larger conversation about the business interests that create incentives around everything that we're talking about. And so I wish we had more time to raise up something that Shireen said at the beginning. If the most urgent conversation we may have coming out of Congress is debating Section 230, it certainly is not the core conversation that we need to be having about an information ecosystem, protections for individuals in society, and a number of other major questions that all of you have raised in the audience. And I hope we can continue to discuss that in the months to come, as it is an urgent question for all of us, not only in the United States, but for citizens around the world grappling with similar versions of these dynamics in their own communities, often with even fewer resources and visibility than even the communities we are failing to address here at home. So with that, I want to thank all four of our panelists for taking the time, as well as the Congressman and Kelly McEvers for kicking us off. And for everyone today joining us virtually for this really important discussion. Hopefully we'll see you on the interwebs or in person soon. Thank you.